The wind in the riverlands was colder than Theon remembered, not like the sea wind of Pike. This chill cut deeper, not just into his skin, but into the bones of memory. He rode beside Robb Stark, not as a hostage, not as a ward, but as a brother. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. Robb's army had just won another battle, small, but it mattered. Every skirmish they won brought them closer to King's Landing, closer to vengeance for Ned Stark, closer to
breaking the Lannister hold on the realm.
Theon had fought bravely in it, slicing down a knight who had tried to flank Robb. That moment had changed something between them. Later that night, around the fire, Robb placed a hand on Theon's shoulder. "You saved my life today." Theon gave a cocky smirk, but his voice was quieter than usual. "What are brothers for?" Robb looked at him with something like gratitude and trust, something Theon hadn't seen in a while. He'd always felt like he had to prove himself, as if being raised in Winterfell didn't mean he was part of it. But tonight, something felt different. Days passed, letters arrived. One came from Pike, Balon Greyjoy, calling for Theon to return home. "The North is distracted," Balon wrote. "Now is the time to strike. Come, boy, be Ironborn." Theon stared at the parchment for a long time. His blood called him one way, but his soul whispered another. He folded the letter and walked into Robb's tent. "I need to talk to you," he said. Robb looked up, already sensing the weight behind Theon's tone. "What is it?" "My father's planning to attack the North. He wants me to help him, to betray you." Robb's face hardened, but
"I won't," Theon continued before Robb could speak. "I owe you more than I ever owed him. If I return to Pike, I can spy from within. I can feed you everything, stop him before it starts." Robb leaned back, clearly torn. "You'd be risking your life." "I'd rather die loyal than live a traitor."
And so it was decided. Theon left the next morning, carrying no banners, no weapons, but his dagger and only a small escort. He returned to the Iron Islands not as a prince, but as a pawn playing his own game. Balon welcomed him coldly. "You came crawling back. Good. Maybe you're finally ready to be my son." Theon lowered his head, playing the role. "I am, father." In the shadows he watched. He listened, and every piece of information he gained, troop movements, fleet routes, secret plans, he sent by Raven to Robb. Back in the North, Robb was ready. The Ironborn struck Deepwood Motte, but the northern forces had already fortified it. Bolton men had joined Robb early, giving him the edge he needed. Skirmishes turned into ambushes.
What should have been a clean Greyjoy invasion became a brutal disaster. Balon raged. "How did they know? Who betrayed us?" Theon kept his face calm. "Maybe they're smarter than you thought. But Yara, Theon's sister, wasn't so easily fooled. One night, she cornered him near the docks. 'You've changed,' she hissed. 'Your eyes are different. You think I don't know what you're doing?' Theon met her stare, his voice steady. 'I'm choosing my own path, not yours, not his.'
She raised her blade just slightly. 'Be careful, little brother. You're playing a dangerous game.' And he was, but he didn't care. For the first time, he had chosen who he wanted to be. Theon's hands trembled as he rinsed the blood off. Them in the salt water. It wasn't his own. 2 Ironborn sailors had caught him near the rookery at night, too close to the ravens. They questioned him, shoved him, and one of them pulled a knife. Only one of them walked away. Theon's heart was pounding even hours later. His mind kept going back to Winterfell, to Robb, to Bran and Rickon, to the family that raised him. Was he becoming a killer for the right side, or just another man trying to survive both worlds? A few days later, he received a reply. A single black feather tied to a scrap of parchment. "Stay strong, the wolf remembers," Robb's handwriting. It meant more than words could say. But in Pike, the storm was coming. Balon had doubled down. Enraged at his early losses, he was sending more ships toward the north, this time with orders to strike Torrhen Square, and maybe, if fortune smiled, Winterfell itself. Theon felt sick hearing the plan. "Winterfell?" he asked, hiding, the tremble in his voice. "Yes," Balon said, his eyes gleaming with pride. "The Stark boy is too far south. He can't protect everything." Theon clenched his jaw. He wanted to scream. "That's my home too," he wanted to say. But he kept quiet. Too many eyes on him. He had to act fast. That night, he stole into the rookery again, sent another raven. "They're targeting Winterfell. I don't know how many, but they're coming. Stop them, please." And then he made a choice that could kill him. He sailed with them. If they were going to try and take Winterfell, then he was going to make sure they failed. From the inside. 3 nights later, the Ironborn reached the shores near the north. The fog was thick. Winterfell's towers rose in the distance, quiet and proud. Inside the walls, Maester Luwin read the Raven aloud. Bran, still young but sharp, listened closely. Sir Rodrik Cassel was already gathering what few men they had. "We hold the gates," Sir Rodrik said. "We hold them till the young wolf returns, or till we bleed dry." The people were scared, but the message from Theon had changed everything. They knew what was coming. This time they weren't walking blind. By morning, the Ironborn stormed the walls, but the traps had already been laid. Oil, stones, arrows. Winterfell was awakened,
angry, and as the Ironborn began to fall back in panic, Theon struck from behind.
He turned on his own. He slit the throat of the Ironborn commander during the retreat and lit fire to the stored siege weapons before they could be used. Chaos exploded among their ranks. Winterfell held. They won. But Theon didn't escape unharmed. He was dragged before Bran and Sir Rodrik, bloodied and bruised, barely breathing. Sir Rodrik raised his sword.
"He's one of them. He brought them here." "No," Bran whispered. "He warned us." Rodrik hesitated. "He's saved Winterfell," Maester Luwin added. "Twice now." Rodrik's hand shook, then lowered his sword. Theon coughed, looking
up at the boy he once called little brother. "I didn't want this," he murmured. "I just wanted to be Stark." Bran nodded slowly, his eyes wet with something deeper than sadness. "You were never just a Greyjoy." Meanwhile, far to the south, Robb Stark sat in his war tent, the letter from Maester Luwin in his hand. Winterfell had survived. Theon had lived. For the first time in weeks, Robb let himself smile, but something
inside him warned. This war was far from over. The raven came at dusk, wings black against the dying sun.
Robb broke the seal with shaking fingers, and as he read Maester Luwin's careful script, His chest swelled with something rare in war: hope. Theon was alive, not just alive, but redeemed. Winterfell had stood tall thanks to his warning. Robbie sat quietly for a long time after reading, the candlelight flickering against his face. Catelyn entered the tent, her eyes searching her son's. "What news?" "Winterfell is safe," he said quietly. "Theon helped save it." Her expression faltered, as if she didn't quite believe it. "That boy has Stark blood in him, even if none of it's by birth," Robb added. "He's proving it." Catelyn looked unconvinced. "Be careful, Robb. A snake that bites someone else can still turn on you." But Robb wasn't listening. In his heart, he already saw the shape of the war changing. Theon's actions had caused a ripple. The Ironborn were humiliated. Balon Greyjoy lost hundreds of men and ships in a failed strike. The North, instead of buckling under the weight of war, had rallied even stronger behind the Starks. And something else shifted. Whispers began to spread. Small folk spoke of Theon Greyjoy not as a traitor, but a man who defied his blood for honor. Soldiers passed the tale between camps, the kraken who bowed to the wolf, a symbol of what loyalty truly meant, but not everyone rejoiced. In King's Landing, Tywin Lannister sat stone-faced at the news. "They held Winterfell," he muttered.
"And the Greyjoy boy betrayed his own kin?" Cersei scoffed. "Fools! Let them tear each other apart. Theon Greyjoy is no hero. He's a frightened boy who picked the winning side."
But Tywin knew better. He could feel the ground shifting beneath the Lannister hold. Robb was gaining power, not just in the field, but in legend. The more stories people told of his victories and his loyal brothers, the harder it would be to defeat him. Meanwhile, Theon sat in a quiet room in Winterfell, healing. His ribs were bruised, his left hand stitched from the knife fight. Bran often visited him, asking questions, speaking softly. He no longer looked like a child. The weight of war had aged him in ways no maester could undo. "Do you think my brother will forgive you?" Bran asked one morning. Theon smiled weakly. "I'm not doing it for forgiveness." "Then why?" He thought for a long time. "Because I spent my whole life trying to prove something to my father, to myself. But it was never real. Here, in this place, I finally did something that mattered." That same day, a raven returned from Robb. A short letter written in the familiar Stark hand. "Come to me. I want you by my side. Theon held the parchment tightly. He hadn't expected this. Not so soon. Part of him wanted to stay in Winterfell forever, hidden in the quiet stone walls where he could disappear into the past. But another part, it burned with purpose. He had betrayed no one this time. He had saved his family. He would serve beside Robb, not as a ward or a tool, but as a man who had chosen his loyalty with full heart. Within a week, he rode south. When Theon entered Robb's war camp again, heads turned. Some eyes were suspicious. Others nodded with respect. Robb stepped forward, smiled, and pulled Theon into a rough embrace. "You came back. You called." Robb looked into his eyes. "Let's win this war, together." Theon grinned. "Let's give the lion something to fear." And in that moment, a wolf and a kraken stood side by side, not as enemies, not even as friends, but as brothers forged by war, ready to tear down a kingdom built on lies. The war drums beat louder now. Every step Robb Stark took southward shook the realm harder than the last. Villages emptied out before his host, not in fear of the young wolf, but in reverence. He wasn't just a boy king anymore. He was a symbol. And beside him, Theon rode, not just as a loyal bannerman, but as the Stark who chose to be one. But not everyone in Robb's camp trusted Theon's return. In the back corners of the war tent, some lords muttered. "Greyjoy's blood runs with salt and treachery," growled Lord Karstark. "He'll turn on us when it suits him." "He turned on his own kin to help us," Robb shot back. "That's more than I can say for some born in the north." Catelyn remained quiet, but her eyes followed Theon constantly. She watched him with the gaze of a mother who had seen too much loss to forgive easily. Still Theon worked. He trained with the soldiers, ate with the men, slept in the mud like everyone else. No armor polished, no special tent, no banners flying above his head. He didn't ask for them, didn't deserve them yet, but what he did earn, bit by bit, was their respect. He sparred
hard, fought harder. And when they came to the ruined castle of Ashermark, he was the first over the wall. It was during that siege, in the dead of night,
that things began to truly shift. Theon and a small scouting party had slipped into the enemy lines to open the gates from the inside. But the Lannister guards were waiting. Ambushed, outnumbered and outmatched, Theon fought like a man possessed. He took 2 blades to the arm, a gash across the leg, and still didn't stop swinging. In the chaos, he saw one of Robb's younger bannermen fall, a boy no older than Bran. Without thinking, Theon threw himself on top of him, shielding him from a Lannister sword. When the gates finally opened and Robb's forces flooded in, they found Theon bloodied, half-conscious, lying in the dirt beside the boy he had saved. Robb knelt beside him, pressing a hand to his wound. "You idiot," he muttered, voice breaking. "You didn't have to do that." Theon smiled through the pain. "I did. He's Stark. So am I." Word spread quickly. Theon Greyjoy, the traitor-turned-hero, had saved the life of Lord Harlton's heir. The same lord who had once vowed never to ride beside a kraken again now offered Theon his banner. Things were changing, but glory had a cost.
King's Landing, Cersei heard the news and slammed her goblet into the wall. "They're turning him into some kind of hero," she spat. Tywin stayed silent, but his jaw clenched. "Then we stop the story before it becomes prophecy." Letters were sent. Gold was promised. Assassins were hired. If Theon Greyjoy wouldn't die a traitor, then he would die a martyr. Meanwhile,
Robb's council debated their next move. Some urged a strike toward Harrenhal. Others wanted to push east and force a direct path to the capital. But Theon, still limping from his wounds, stood in the council tent and pointed at the map. "Them think we're coming for Harrenhal, but instead we split the force. 2 paths, one led by Rose Bolton, the other by you. And I'll lead a 3rd unit behind enemy lines, cut off their supplies, bleed them slowly." Silence followed. "You're still healing," Catelyn warned. "You'd be vulnerable." "I'm not afraid of dying," Theon replied. "I just don't want it to be for nothing." Robb met his eyes. "All right, we do it your way." And so, Theon Greyjoy became more than just a sword. He became the blade that slid in quiet and struck where no one expected. The quiet kraken, who hunted lions in the dark but in the shadow of glory. Something darker was coming. The nights grew colder as Theon and his small band slipped through Lannister-controlled lands. These were no armies, just 20 men hand-picked, fast, quiet, brutal when needed. Their mission was simple: disrupt supply lines, torch camps, sow fear. In war, chaos was as deadly as any sword. But Theon knew he was being watched. It started with a shadow in the trees, a snapped twig behind their camp. Then a corpse found strung up, eyes removed, tongue cut out. A warning. Someone was tracking him. He told no one. He didn't want fear spreading through the men. And deep down, maybe he thought he deserved it. After all, how many people had he betrayed in his life? Still, the attacks worked. By the time Robb reached the Red Fork, Lannister soldiers were half-starved, half-mad, deserting in droves. Campfires burned without food. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Morale was breaking, and with every passing day, Theon's legend grew. The ghost of the West, they whispered. The sea-born killer, the kraken that hunts at night. Even Robb started to notice the shift. He's not the same man we grew up with, he told Catelyn. He's sharper, colder. That's what war does, she replied. It burns the soul until all that's left is steel or ash. But not everyone praised Theon's rise. Rose Bolton watched from the shadows of the War Council, his face unreadable. He didn't like men who inspired loyalty, especially not ones who stole it from others. And soon he would make a choice that would turn everything. But for now, Theon pushed deeper into enemy territory. It was on the 12th night, under a sky choked with smoke, that it happened. His camp was ambushed, not by Lannister soldiers. These men moved differently. Quiet, precise, faces covered in black. Assassins. Theon woke to the sound of steel and screaming. His second in command died instantly, throat slit, while checking the perimeter. 2 more fell before Theon even had his boots on. He grabbed his sword and fought barefoot through mud and blood. One of the attackers broke through, drove a dagger toward his heart, but Theon twisted, catching the blade in his ribs instead. The pain was blinding. He managed to kill the man, but as he stumbled, clutching his side, another figure stepped from the shadows. Taller, calm, face bare, a sellsword, one of the infamous faceless agents Tywin had once used in Essos. "You're
a hard man to kill, Greyjoy," he said coldly. Theon raised his blade anyway, blood leaking from his mouth. "You're too late."
The assassin smirked. "Too late for what?" Theon spat blood. "To stop me from mattering." Then he lunged. It was a wild swing, clumsy, desperate, but it was enough. The assassin staggered back. One of Theon's remaining men, half dead, drove, a spear into his spine. The camp burned around them. When dawn came, only 6 of them remained. Theon was barely conscious, wounds infected, face pale. They carried him out on a makeshift stretcher, heading back to Robb's lines. News of the attack reached Robb within 2 days. He rode out himself against every advisor's orders. When he found Theon, still alive but feverish, he dismounted and knelt beside him. "You're the dumbest, most stubborn bastard I've ever known." Theon tried to laugh, but coughed instead. "Coming from you, that's an honor." Robb gripped his hand. "You saved more men than I'll ever know. I'm not letting you die now." But Theon's eyes flickered. "If I do, just remember." "I chose this. I chose you." Robb said nothing, just held his brother's hand until the healers came. As night fell, the camp remained silent. Everyone knew now. The Lannisters wanted Theon dead more than anyone, because Theon Greyjoy had become something far more dangerous than a warrior. He had become a symbol, and symbols, they were harder to kill than kings. Theon awoke 3 days later, wrapped in sweat-soaked furs, his body heavy with pain. Maester Corlin, the healer Robb had brought from River Run, hovered nearby, checking his wounds, muttering about infection and madness. But Theon didn't care about the pain. He was alive, and more than that, he had survived them. When he sat up, weak but aware, Robb was there, arms crossed, a rare smile on his face. You scared half the camp. Even the dogs were mourning. Theon chuckled softly. Did you cry? Shut up, Robb smirked. Maybe, but something in Robb's face shifted. The smile faded, a storm lingered behind his eyes. What is it? Theon asked. Robb sat beside him and lowered his voice. I think there's a traitor among us. Someone told the Lannisters where your camp was, someone who wanted you dead. Theon frowned. You're sure? Too precise, too sudden. They knew exactly where to strike. Theon leaned back against the wall, exhaling. You're thinking Bolton. I'm not saying it out loud yet, Robb replied, but I've started moving quietly, watching who speaks to who, shuffling orders so only certain men know about specific movements. Theon nodded slowly. Good, you're learning. Orbiti looked at him with an odd smile. You know, you've changed. I had to. Robb stood, hands behind his back. I'm going to make you a lord. Theon blinked. What? You've earned it. My bannermen respect you. The men follow. You like you were born with a wolf's head on your chest. When this war's over, if we take the north and the riverlands, I'll give you lands, a seat, your own banner, as a Stark. Theon's mouth went dry. You'd do that for me? Robb's voice was firm. No, you did this for yourself. I'm just recognizing it. But behind the joy, behind the promise, darker tides were turning. Far to the south, in dread-fought colours and shadows, Rose Bolton was watching. He had seen what Theon was becoming, and he didn't like it. Theon's presence, his loyalty, his honour. It ruined everything Bolton was building. A war-torn north was easy to carve, but a united one, led by Robb Stark and his Kraken brother, too dangerous. That night Rose summoned his bastard son, Ramsay. You'll ride to Winterfell, Rose said softly. Ramsay raised an eyebrow, licking grease off his fingers. Why? Rose's smile was slow and poisonous. Because we may not be able to break the wolf from the front, but maybe we burn his home from behind. Burn it? No, Rose said. Make them beg for fire. Ramsay grinned. Now that sounds fun. The orders were sent. The Boltons began preparing quietly, hiding their shift behind loyalty oaths and falsified maps. And Robb still didn't see it coming. 2 weeks later, Theon was strong enough to ride again. He and Robb stood at the edge of the Blackwater Rush, overlooking a fresh battle won, 3 Lannister camps destroyed, supply lines collapsed, Tywin forced to retreat south to defend his holdings. You ever think we might actually win this? Robb asked. Theon nodded. If you stay smart and keep your sword sharp. Robb turned. You're part of this victory, Theon. Don't forget that. But even as they spoke, a raven was flying north, bearing orders soaked in treason. Orders to take Winterfell. Orders signed by Rose Bolton. And this time, Theon wouldn't be there to save it. The snow had started falling again. Thick, heavy flakes drifted over the north like a warning from the gods. In Winterfell, Bran stared out from the tower window, watching the sky turn grey. There was a weight in the air. Something was wrong. Maester Luwin felt it too. The ravens had stopped coming from certain corners of the north. Villages that once sent word of bandit sightings or wolf howls had gone silent. One by one the lights were going out, and then came the knock. Ramsay Snow arrived at Winterfell's gates wrapped in Bolton red, his banner twisted with the flayed man. His face carried a smile too smooth for winter, and his words dripped with
false loyalty. My father sends his strength, he said sweetly, to protect the young lords of Winterfell while the king fights in the south. Sir Roderick didn't trust him. Neither did Bran, but with only a few dozen guards. What choice
did they have? We welcome House Bolton, Maester Luwin said, hiding the tremor in his voice. That night, everything changed. Far to the south, Theon's nightmares returned. The scent of seaweed, the sound of his father's voice whispering disappointment. But worse now, he saw fire, flames licking at stone, screams echoing through snow-covered halls, and always Bran's face, burned into his dreams. He woke up, gasping, sweat cold on his brow. Robb entered moments later, armor strapped, eyes serious. There's something wrong in the north, he said. No ravens from Winterfell in 6 days. Theon's blood turned to ice. Ravens don't stop unless someone stops them. Robb nodded grimly. I want to send scouts, but I'm stretched thin. If I ride north now, Tywin will strike my rear. I'll go. Robb hesitated. You just recovered. I'll go, Theon repeated. You've got battles down here. Winterfell, that's mine too. Robb stared at him for a long moment, then gripped his forearm. Bring them home. Theon rode north with 10 men, trusted riders, quiet ones. The journey was cold, cruel, and filled with signs of decay. Burned-out farmhouses, torn banners, no people, only silence. By the time they neared Winterfell, Theon's gut twisted in dread. The gates were closed, but the smoke, it was faint. Not war smoke, cooking smoke. Winterfell wasn't destroyed, not yet, but the banners flying from its towers were wrong. The stark direwolf still flew, but beneath it the flayed man of House Bolton twisted in the wind like a joke, a mockery. Theon dismounted. We go in as travellers, he ordered. If anything feels off, we ride through the night. No rest, no mercy. They entered at dusk. The castle was quiet, too quiet. Inside, Bolton soldiers lingered around fires, half-drunk, faces smug. Theon was escorted to the great hall by a boy no older than 10, eyes sunken and lips chapped from cold. Ramsay will see you, the boy whispered. But don't look him in the eye too long. The words chilled him more than the wind. Ramsay stood by the fire, slicing an apple with a long, narrow knife. Well, well, he said without turning. The Kraken comes home again.
How many times must you circle this castle before you learn it doesn't belong to you?
Theon's jaw tightened. Where's Bran? Ramsay smiled. Safe, warm, sleeping. And the Maester? Ramsay took a bite of the apple. Hanging. Theon drew his dagger before he realized it, but 10 Bolton men surrounded him instantly.
Ramsay didn't flinch. You really think Robb will reach you before I skin your face? He asked, voice low, deadly. Theon stepped back slowly.
You'll regret this. No, Ramsay whispered. You will. But Theon didn't wait to argue. He spun, lunged, drove his dagger into the throat of the nearest guard. A bolt of chaos ripped through the hall. One of his men was killed before he reached the door. Another was dragged down, screaming. But Theon ran. He escaped through the stables, blood on his hands, fire in his chest. As he fled through the snow-choked woods, he left behind everything he had saved months.
Ego Winterfell had fallen again, but this time it was personal. The snow whipped across Theon's face as he rode.
His horse staggered beneath him, lungs burning from the cold. His cloak was soaked in blood, some of it his, most of it not. Behind him, smoke rose from Winterfell's towers. Again, but this time he wasn't confused. He wasn't broken. He was angry. By the time he reached Robb's war camp near the twins, he collapsed at the gate. They carried him to Robb in silence. Robb stood over his battered body as the healers worked, eyes burning with questions. When Theon could finally speak, his voice was hoarse. Bolton betrayed you. Robb said nothing, just turned and walked out of the tent. That night, no songs were sung by the fires. By morning, the banners were raised. The direwolf no longer ran alone. It now marched beside the kraken, and every man in the camp knew they weren't riding for war anymore. They were riding for vengeance. The ride to Winterfell was brutal, snowstorm after snowstorm, hidden Bolton traps along the roads, frozen rivers forcing detours, but the army pushed on, driven by rage. Robb never dismounted. Theon never spoke much. He rode with a wound in his ribs, but fire in his eyes. When they finally saw Winterfell again, it was a black silhouette against the ash-colored sky. Ramsay was waiting. The gates were barred, the walls reinforced, and above the towers flew the flayed man, stretched over a burning wolf. Robb stared up at it, jaw clenched. He wants me to see it. Theon stepped beside him. He wants you to hesitate. Will you? Robb asked. Theon shook his head. No. The siege began at dawn. Catapults, flaming arrows, screaming war horns. It was chaos. But Bolton men were ruthless, and Ramsay was clever. He sent out captured villagers, tied to poles as living shields. He burned the surrounding woods to blind the attackers. He laughed from the walls as his archers cut down wave after wave, but Robb didn't break, and Theon didn't wait. On the third night, under moonless dark, Theon led a small team through the collapsed tunnel Bran had once used to escape the castle. It was tight, damp, and half-flooded, but it led beneath the walls, just like before. And just like before, Theon returned to Winterfell through the shadows. This time, not to conquer, not to betray, but to save. They found Bran in the crypts, alive, cold, pale, but alive. Hodor had protected him, along with Mira and Jojen, hiding him in the tombs beneath the old kings. They hadn't eaten in 2 days. Theon looked into Bran's
hollow eyes and dropped to his knees. I came back, Bran nodded slowly. You always do. Above, the final battle raged. Theon led Bran and the others out through the tunnel as Robb breached the gates with a battering ram.
The walls fell. Stark soldiers surged through, cutting down flayed men in every corridor. Robb found Ramsay in the great hall, seated on the high seat, smiling as if he hadn't already lost. Come to take your home back, Wolf? Robb stepped forward. It was never yours. Ramsay stood, blades in hand. You'll have to kill me. I was hoping you'd say that. The duel was quick, brutal, and personal. Robb fought with the fury of a broken brother. Ramsay fought like a man, with nothing left to lose. They bled, clashed steel on stone, roared curses and pain, but in the end, Robb's sword split through Ramsay's gut. He collapsed in a puddle of his own blood, still smiling. Too late. The kingdom was already rotting. Then he died. Winterfell stood silent for the first time in weeks. The fires were put out, the banners of the Boltons torn down. The stark wolf flew alone again. Theon stood in the godswood that night, snow falling soft across his shoulders. Robb approached.
Quietly, you saved my brother. Theon didn't look up. I owed him more than that.
You saved Winterfell. I should have done it years ago. Robb placed a hand on his shoulder. You're not Greyjoy anymore. Theon turned. Then what am I? Robb looked at him like a brother. You're a Stark. The North knows it. And I do too. That winter was long. The war dragged on. But the songs would be sung differently now. Not just of the young wolf, but of the kraken who bled for a home that was never his, who chose love over loyalty, honor over fear, and who, in the end, found his place, not by blood, but by choice. Theon Greyjoy, the last lost son of Winterfell, had finally come home.